Most FBI operations are designed to be seen. Arrests are photographed, indictments are unsealed. Success is measured in headlines. This one was different. We want to know, where in the world are you watching from? Comment below and subscribe. For years, its existence was known only to a handful of people inside a secure room, men and women who understood that if this operation ever became public at the wrong moment, it wouldn't just fail, it would collapse completely. What makes this story extraordinary is not what the FBI achieved, but how close it came to losing everything because of a decision that, on paper, seemed harmless. There were no explosions, no dramatic raids, no last-second heroics caught on camera. Instead, there was silence. A silence that hid missed signals, internal disagreements, and a growing realization inside the Bureau that the operation they believed they controlled was quietly slipping away from them. At the center of it all was a threat that didn't look like one: no uniforms, no obvious violence, nothing that would alarm the public. And that was the problem. The FBI had dealt with criminals before. They had dealt with spies. They had dealt with organized networks operating in the shadows. But this time, they were facing something far more uncomfortable, a situation where acting too early would expose everything, and acting too late might make the operation meaningless. Internal reports began to contradict each other. Field agents disagreed with headquarters. Warnings were written down, then buried, and somewhere along the chain of command, a critical assumption was made, an assumption that would later be described as reasonable at the time. Reasonable assumptions have ended more intelligence operations than enemy actions ever have. What the public never saw was how close the FBI came to pulling the plug. How a single misstep, one conversation overheard, one document misplaced, one delay of a few hours could have turned a classified operation into a national embarrassment, or worse. Because failure, in this case, wouldn't have meant walking away empty-handed. It would have meant alerting the very people the FBI was trying to observe, people who would disappear the moment they realized they were being watched. This is the story of that operation. Not the version summarized in official briefings, but the version that almost never left the archive. The threat did not arrive suddenly. It did not announce itself. And that is why it was underestimated at the time. The FBI was focused on more visible dangers: organized crime, foreign intelligence services, and networks that left a clear trail of activity. What they were not prepared for was a problem that blended so seamlessly into everyday life that it barely registered as a priority. On paper, nothing seemed urgent. The individuals involved were not violent offenders. They did not fit established profiles. They operated legally, at least on the surface. Early reports described them as low risk, routine, unremarkable. Field offices flagged a pattern, but patterns without immediate consequences rarely trigger alarms. They are logged, summarized, and often postponed for later review. And that is exactly what happened. The FBI's internal assessments relied heavily on historical precedent. Similar situations in the past had led nowhere. Investigations had been opened, resources allocated, and eventually reassigned when nothing concrete emerged. This time, analysts believed, would be no different, but there was a flaw in that reasoning. The threat was not based on what these individuals were doing, it was based on what they were not doing. No communications that stood out, no financial transactions that crossed obvious lines, no actions that justified aggressive intervention. What appeared to be inactivity was, in reality, discipline. Inside the Bureau, concern grew slowly, quietly. Some agents argued that the absence of mistakes was itself suspicious. Others pushed back, warning against overreaction. The FBI had been criticized before for acting too broadly, too aggressively. There was pressure to be precise, careful, conservative. That pressure shaped every decision. Supervisors requested more evidence. Analysts asked for clearer indicators. Legal teams emphasized restraint. Each delay felt responsible, rational, safe, but delays compound. As weeks turned into months, the gap between what some agents suspected and what leadership acknowledged widened. The operation remained classified, but it remained small, underfunded, underprioritized. No one wanted to be responsible for escalating a case that might ultimately lead nowhere. In hindsight, this was the most dangerous phase. Because the threat was evolving, not outwardly, but strategically. Those under observation adjusted their behavior, not in response to the FBI, but in anticipation of scrutiny that they assumed would eventually come. They were patient. They did not rush, and patience is difficult to counter when you are trained to look for urgency. What the Bureau failed to recognize was that by treating the situation as low risk, they were shaping the operation's limits before it had even begun. Surveillance protocols were modest, oversight was minimal. Communication between departments was fragmented. It was not negligence, it was institutional momentum. By the time concerns reached senior levels, the operation had already been defined: quiet, narrow, cautious. Changing course would require justification. No one yet felt they had. The threat nobody took seriously was no longer just external, it was internal. By the time the operation was formally approved, it already carried the weight of compromise. Not in its objectives, but in its design. Inside FBI headquarters, the planning phase was presented as a model of restraint. This was not meant to be an aggressive investigation. It was meant to observe, verify, and quietly conclude. A clean operation, minimal exposure, minimal risk. At least, that was the theory. Planning meetings focused on what could not be done as much as on what could. Surveillance options were narrowed. Technical methods were limited by legal thresholds that leadership was determined not to cross prematurely. No one wanted a repeat of past controversies. The result was an operation that relied heavily on precision and timing, to things that leave little room for error. The team assembled for the task was small, selected for experience, not numbers. Analysts who understood long-term monitoring. Field agents known for discretion rather than confrontation. Every detail was documented. Communication protocols were defined down to the minute. Reports were structured to avoid unnecessary speculation. Even internal language was carefully chosen, favoring neutral terms over conclusions. What looked like professionalism also created distance. Departments worked in parallel rather than in constant coordination. Information moved upward through layers of review, each one smoothing out urgency in favor of clarity. By the time a concern reached decision-makers, it often arrived stripped of emotion. That was intentional. Emotion complicates approval. Legal advisors played a central role. Each proposed step was evaluated not just for effectiveness, but for how it would appear if scrutinized later. The operation had to survive courtrooms as well as field conditions. This emphasis on defensibility shaped the strategy. Instead of proactive measures, the plan leaned toward observation. Instead of direct engagement, it favored indirect confirmation. The goal was to let the subjects reveal themselves through routine behavior. It was a gamble, one that assumed time was an advantage. In internal briefings, the operation was described as stable. There was no expectation of rapid escalation. Resources were allocated accordingly, backup plans existed, but they were theoretical contingencies that no one expected to activate. A critical assumption underpinned everything, that the Bureau controlled the tempo. What planners underestimated was how much of that control depended on silence, on the subjects remaining unaware, on no external variable interfering. one overlooked conversation, one administrative delay, one misrouted request. Any of these could change the equation. Some agents raised concerns quietly. They questioned whether the operation was too narrow, too dependent on everything going exactly as planned. Those concerns were acknowledged and deferred. The logic was simple. If nothing had gone wrong yet, why complicate things? As the final plan was signed off, there was confidence in the room, not excitement. Not tension, confidence, the kind that comes from believing every risk has been accounted for. History would later show that the most dangerous risks are often the ones that seem too unlikely to plan for. Every large operation eventually narrows to a single point of failure. In this case, it was a man whose name appeared only sporadically in early reports. Not flagged as a priority, not highlighted in briefings. Just a recurring presence, consistent, unremarkable, easy to overlook. That was precisely what made him valuable. He was not the leader, he was not the face. He was not the one drawing attention. Instead, he occupied a position that allowed him to move between circles without friction, professional enough to appear legitimate, invisible enough to avoid suspicion. The kind of individual operations depend on without ever acknowledging how fragile that dependence is. To the FBI, he was an access point, someone who could bridge gaps that surveillance could not. Someone whose proximity made up for the limits imposed by cautious planning. Through him, analysts hoped to confirm what months of observation had not. But reliance creates vulnerability. The man understood his environment better than anyone else involved. He knew what questions could be asked and which ones could not. He sensed shifts in behavior, changes in tone. Pauses that lasted a fraction too long. None of that appeared in reports. On paper, he was cooperative, reliable, predictable. What those reports did not capture was the pressure he was under. Not from the FBI but from the uncertainty of his own position. He existed between two realities, trusted fully by neither. This is where operations often begin to fail, not through betrayal but through misalignment. The FBI assumed loyalty because there was no evidence of resistance. They assumed stability because nothing had changed externally. What they did not account for was internal strain. The man had his own motivations, some practical, some personal, none of them fully aligned with the Bureau's long-term strategy. He was not thinking in terms of months or years, he was thinking in terms of survival. As the operation progressed, subtle shifts began to appear, minor deviations from routine, delays that were easy to explain individually, but troubling in aggregate. Analysts noticed, they documented, they debated. No action followed. Escalating concerns would have required admitting that the operation's most important asset might also be its greatest risk. That acknowledgement carried consequences: legal, procedural, political. So caution prevailed. Meetings focused on maintaining balance, keeping the man engaged without applying pressure, preserving access without revealing dependence. It was a delicate equilibrium, one that assumed rational behavior from someone operating under constant uncertainty. In retrospect, the warning signs were there. Not dramatic, not urgent, but consistent. The man was not failing the operation was failing to understand him. By placing him at the center without redefining the structure around him, the FBI had created a scenario where a single unpredictable decision could unravel months of work. And that decision, when it came, would not look dramatic. It would look ordinary, a choice made quietly, a moment passed without notice, the kind of moment operations rarely recover from. Make sure you're subscribed. You don't want to miss what happens next. There was no single moment when the operation collapsed. Instead, it began to fray at first. The changes were subtle enough to ignore. A report arrived later than expected. A scheduled meeting was postponed without explanation. A routine communication went unanswered for several hours, longer than normal. None of it justified intervention on its own. Inside the Bureau, analysts debated whether these deviations mattered at all. Patterns require context, and context was limited by design. The operation had been built to observe quietly, not to intrude. That restraint now became a liability. Field agents reported that behavior on the ground felt different. Not wrong, just altered. Conversations shortened. Interactions became more deliberate. The kind of adjustments people make when they believe they are being watched, even if they cannot confirm it. Headquarters asked for clarification. Clarification produced uncertainty. Uncertainty produced delay. The man at the center of the operation continued to cooperate, but something had shifted. His availability became inconsistent. Explanations grew more detailed, more rehearsed. The very professionalism that once reassured analysts now raised questions. Was he managing risk or reacting to it? No one could say. Internal communications grew tense. Different departments interpreted the same information in opposing ways. Some argued that the operation was approaching a breakthrough, others warned that the window was closing. Both could not be true. What complicated matters further was the absence of a clear trigger point. There was no predefined threshold that demanded escalation. No rule that said, this is where observation ends and intervention begins. The plan assumed that moment would be obvious. It wasn't. Instead, the Bureau faced a series of decisions that each felt manageable, but collectively moved the operation toward instability. Surveillance was adjusted slightly, oversight increased incrementally. Questions were asked more directly. Each adjustment increased risk, and risk, once introduced, rarely remains contained. At one point, a routine administrative request crossed the wrong desk. Not because of negligence, but because systems are built for efficiency, not secrecy. The request did not expose the operation, but it created a trace. A trace someone might notice. That possibility triggered internal alarm. Meetings were called, assessments rewritten. Legal teams consulted. The language of briefings changed from stable to developing. Time, once considered an ally, was now a constraint. Agents on the ground pushed for direction. They needed clarity either to move forward or to pull back. What they received instead were conditional instructions, carefully worded and intentionally vague. Maintain position. Avoid escalation. Report immediately if conditions change. Conditions were already changing. The operation reached a point where every option carried risk. Acting too forcefully could expose the Bureau's interest. Doing nothing might allow the situation to slip beyond control. This is where institutional caution becomes paralysis. The FBI had prepared for many scenarios, but not for one where the greatest danger was indecision itself. Behind closed doors, contingency plans were revisited. Extraction timelines were discussed for the first time, not because failure was expected, but because it was now possible. And that acknowledgement, once made, altered everything. From that moment on, the operation was no longer about success. It was about damage control. By this stage, the operation was balanced on a narrow margin. There was no room left for experimentation, no tolerance for error. Every decision had to be correct the first time because there would be no second chance. Inside FBI headquarters, the language shifted again. Briefings grew shorter, distribution lists shrank. Information was compartmentalized further, not to increase secrecy, but to reduce exposure if things went wrong. That was the unspoken assumption. On the ground, agents sensed the tension immediately. Instructions arrived more frequently, but said less. Emphasis was placed on restraint, even as signs of instability became harder to ignore. The man at the center of the operation missed a scheduled interaction. Not dramatically, not suspiciously, he simply wasn't there. In isolation, it meant nothing. In context, it meant everything. Field agents reported the absence, analysts reviewed recent activity. Nothing indicated immediate danger, no communication suggesting compromise. No external signal that the operation had been detected. And yet, the absence lingered. When contact was re-established hours later, the explanation was plausible, ordinary, the kind of explanation people offer when they don't want to invite further questions. The problem was that it closed too many doors at once. At this point, the FBI faced a choice it had avoided for months. Escalate or accept uncertainty. Escalation carried obvious risks. Increased surveillance might alert the subjects. Legal thresholds would be crossed, triggering documentation that could later be scrutinized. Once taken, those steps could not be undone, but uncertainty carried its own danger. Because uncertainty meant operating blind. A critical meeting took place late in the day, involving representatives from multiple divisions. The discussion was not about objectives anymore. It was about containment. What would happen if the operation failed tonight? Not hypothetically, but practically, extraction plans were reviewed. Exposure scenarios mapped out, legal ramifications assessed. Someone asked whether the operation had already crossed the point of no return. No one answered. What made the situation more dangerous was how ordinary everything still looked from the outside. There were no sirens, no sudden movements, no indication that anything extraordinary was happening. That normality was deceptive. Behind the scenes, the margin for error had shrunk to minutes. A single phone call placed at the wrong time. A casual comment overheard by the wrong person. One surveillance asset noticed where it shouldn't be. Any of these could trigger collapse. Then came the moment that nearly ended it. A routine procedural step approved days earlier was executed without awareness of the changed context. It followed protocol perfectly, it violated no rules. But it assumed conditions that no longer existed. For a brief window, the operation exposed itself, not fully, not obviously, just enough inside the bureau. The reaction was immediate. Communication froze. Additional steps were halted mid-process. Agents were instructed to hold position and await further instruction. For several hours, no one knew whether the exposure had been detected. Those hours would later be described as the longest of the operation. Because if the exposure had been noticed, the response would not be gradual. The subjects would disappear, evidence would evaporate. Access would be lost permanently. The FBI waited. And in that waiting, the operation hovered one mistake away from total failure. When the moment finally came, it did not arrive with urgency. It arrived with exhaustion. Hours of waiting had drained the operation of momentum. There were no new signals, no confirmation that exposure had been detected, but no reassurance either. Silence, once again, became the dominant variable. Inside FBI headquarters, leadership faced a decision they had postponed for as long as possible. Do nothing and risk learning too late that the operation had already been compromised, or intervene and accept responsibility for whatever consequences followed. This was not a choice between success and failure. It was a choice between controlled risk and uncontrolled loss. The discussion that followed was brief, not because the issue lacked complexity, but because every argument had already been made in earlier meetings. What remained was judgment. Some advocated immediate disengagement, preserve what remained, accept that the operation had reached its natural limit. Others argued for a narrow, carefully calibrated move, one that might stabilize the situation without revealing intent. That option carried the greatest danger. Partial action is often more visible than decisive action. In the end, the decision reflected the nature of the operation itself, cautious, precise, and deliberately understated. A single directive was issued, not an escalation, but a correction. Procedures were adjusted quietly, communication channels were rerouted. The man at the center of the operation was given minimal guidance, enough to restore alignment, not enough to raise suspicion. No new assets were introduced, no overt surveillance was activated. Nothing happened that an outside observer would notice. From the Bureau's perspective, this was the final move available without triggering irreversible consequences. If it worked, the operation would stabilize. If it failed, there would be no warning. The hours that followed passed slowly. Reports arrived on schedule. Interactions resumed their previous rhythm. No sudden disappearances, no abrupt changes in behavior. Gradually, tension eased. Not because success had been confirmed, but because failure had not occurred. That distinction mattered. The operation did not recover completely. Trust, once strained, does not return to its original state. But it continued, quietly, carefully, inside the FBI. The decision was recorded as justified, necessary, appropriate, given the circumstances. What was not recorded was how close leadership came to choosing differently. Because had they delayed a few more hours or acted with slightly more force, the outcome would have been radically different. The operation survived not through brilliance, but through restraint applied at exactly the right moment. A reminder that in intelligence work, the most important decisions are often the least visible ones. On paper, the operation was a success. Objectives had been met, exposure had been avoided. No public fallout followed. In official summaries, the outcome was described using neutral language: concluded, resolved, contained. The kind of wording that signals closure without inviting questions. But inside the Bureau, few believed that version told the whole story. The operation ended without incident, yet it left behind a trail of quiet consequences. Not dramatic enough to warrant investigation, not visible enough to demand accountability, but significant nonetheless. Internally, analysts reviewed the timeline again and again. They focused not on what had happened, but on what almost had. The near exposure, the procedural misstep, the fragile dependence on a single individual. None of those elements appeared in final reports. They were discussed informally, in closed meetings. In lessons learned documents that circulated briefly before being archived. The man at the center of the operation faded from view. His role concluded without ceremony, no acknowledgement. No debrief that captured the full extent of what he had carried. Operations move on. People absorb the pressure and then disappear back into anonymity. For field agents involved, the aftermath was disorienting. Months of tension ended not with resolution, but with quiet reassignment. New cases, new priorities, the expectation that they would not dwell on what could not be proven. That expectation was implicit, but clear. Within leadership circles, the operation became a reference point, not a warning, but a precedent. Evidence that restraint could work, that silence could be managed. That risk could be contained without escalation. What was overlooked was the cost of that restraint. Opportunities were missed, intelligence remained incomplete. The broader network, whatever its full scope, was never fully mapped. The operation had survived, but it had not succeeded in the way it was originally envisioned. This created an uncomfortable tension. Publicly, the Bureau could point to stability. Privately, there was an awareness that stability had been achieved by narrowing ambition rather than expanding understanding. No formal inquiry followed. There was nothing to investigate. No failure to assign, no rule clearly broken. And that, perhaps, was the most troubling outcome. Because operations that nearly fail but don't rarely generate reform, they reinforce existing structures. They validate caution, they encourage repetition. The lessons of this operation were subtle, easy to overlook, easier still to misinterpret. It became a case study not in collapse, but in proximity to it. And proximity leaves no visible scar. Years later, the operation remains classified. Not because of what it exposed, but because of what it revealed about the limits of control. From the outside, it would be easy to dismiss it as a minor case. No arrests, no public reckoning, no documents leaked to the press, nothing that altered headlines or reshaped policy. And yet, inside the intelligence community, it left a lasting impression. This operation demonstrated something uncomfortable, that modern investigations do not always fail loudly. Sometimes, they fail quietly by stopping just short of understanding the full picture. What made this case significant was not the threat itself, but the process surrounding it. The assumptions that guided decision-making. The reliance on restraint as a safeguard rather than a risk factor. The belief that silence could be managed indefinitely. Those assumptions still shape operations today. Technology has advanced. Surveillance tools are more precise, data moves faster. But the core dilemma remains unchanged. How long can you observe without intervening? At what point does caution become exposure? And who decides when uncertainty is no longer acceptable? The operation also highlighted the human dimension of intelligence work. Systems can be designed for efficiency, procedures can be optimized for legality. But people operate under pressure, fatigue, and incomplete information. The man at the center of this story was not an anomaly. He was a reminder that individuals carry the weight of institutional decisions, often without acknowledgement, and without margin for error. Perhaps the most important lesson is this: operations that almost fail are rarely studied in depth. They do not trigger reforms. They do not generate headlines. They quietly reinforce the belief that existing methods are sufficient. Until they aren't, the FBI operation that almost failed completely did not end in disaster, but it exposed how close even the most disciplined institutions can come to losing control, not through recklessness, but through precision taken too far. That is why it still matters, because the next operation may not recover in time, and because the most dangerous failures are often the ones we never see. What do you think about this story? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Support the channel by subscribing and sharing this story with your friends. It helps a lot.